Okay, so hi guys. Today I'll be doing the session for y'all. This is basically okay. That's just an introduction for myself. I'm Keshan, and so today's session is all about this keyword. So I hope that everyone who works with JavaScript or whoever who part-timely develop JavaScript applications must be used or must have used this commonly. So today we're gonna check in depth on the context of this keyword, or maybe how exactly this keyword is being implemented within the JS engine. So let's just go through some quick examples of what we commonly been developing on this, and some examples on it. So this is our first example. So this is just pure JS, and I just have an object which has attribute called size, and there's another attribute called boat info, and that boat info is being assigned to a function. And I do have two lines. The first line is an alert which cross check this equals boat, and then alert this dot size. So when I try to call boat, that particular object which I have constructed dot boat info, basically that has to execute that particular function for that boat info. Can someone say what are the values the alert will have for both? Will boat info execution have the boat context? Will that be true or not? And this dot size, what will it display? Does anyone know? It's basically okay.
Yeah, nobody can guess. You don't have to know the answer, just.
Yeah, you can just guess it. Okay.
It's either true or false, right? So. It's false.
So the first one is false, you say, and the other one is this dot size. What is the value that you'll get?
And why do you think is that?
Yeah.
Global context.
How did you get the global context there?
Yeah.
Because we are calling it on top of that object, right? So we are in the object scope. Are we?
Okay. Does that make sense to you? Is it false or is it true? So it's basically like this. Now this particular board.info. Maybe I'll say this particular board.info and this board. This construction of this particular object is being done in a global scope. Maybe you say it in the Windows level. So board.board info. This particular function is within this particular object. So that has to refer to the board. That is fine. So what if what will happen after this if I have another big boat object and I have a size big, and I'm just trying to get the boat info being transferred to big boat's boat info. I mean, I'm just creating another attribute boat info in this particular point for the big boat, and I'm assigning boat's boat info to this particular boat info attribute that I'm defining at this point. And when I call big boat info, what would happen? Does the same context of boat info is being passed to big boat's boat info or not? No. Why is that?
when you assign that the value assignment part is happening on the global context. I think that will be like that.
Okay, so that's right. So what happens here is basically I am taking boat.boatinfo is just the reference of this particular function only. I'm not taking the inherited object of boat. So it's this gonna be just another reference of just this particular function, not boat.boatinfo. So what would be the results for here is this won't be equal to boat. It's again going to be redefined to this going to be equals to big boat. Because of that, this will be a false statement, and we have redefined the size for it as big so that we display it as big.
So if I reiterate the same thing, what's going to happen is now we are assigning bigboard.boatinfo with a function reference, right? Just forget about this part, whatever we have here. Ideally, what's going to happen is now we have an object, and within that object we have a function created here, and whenever you do an assignment to another variable or object property, wherever it is, whenever you assign a function to any other variable, then what happens is it's gonna it's actually not going to copy or clone the actual function, but it's going to use that function reference. So that this is the particular function reference. So it's going to have that function reference over here, and whenever this particular function is getting executed, you have to think of the execution context. So the execution context of this particular function right now in this object would be bigboard.
There is another example. So we do have two functions, identify and speak, and then I have two objects, me and you. And I hope that you all learned in previous sessions about call, bind, and all. So so here it's basically what call does is I'm calling the identify function with a call, and I'm passing my context. What context has to be used within the identify, and yeah. So I'm using two different contexts. One is me, and the other one is you. So both objects have been passed to identify, and in speak.callMe. Again, the same thing happens. The references, the object references has been passed to this function again. So now when I execute these, identify gets this particular context means it basically will call the name or the key, and then the for second execution it will be the reader. So basically, you will get the names that are being used here, and the same thing happens here. Now, if we see, what exactly happens here is it's all about what is your context or exactly what you've been used to execute a particular function, or the scope of that particular function. Now let's say this, normally we use this is when we wanted to iterate within a function. That's one thing that we can do. Like if you want to recall a function within the function's body, we try to use this so that we think that this means it refers to that particular function's context. So that we try to use this and we try to recall it. Or maybe within the function's context, you try to redefine any scope. So let's see these examples. So now what we're going to see is the misconception that we have is calling within a particular function's context. That is what we're going to see. So okay, so now we have a different function called foo, and I'm passing a parameter num, and that has a console log. I'm just console logging it, and I have a count, keep on incrementing. Okay, so when and I also in the global scope I have foo.count equals 0, uh, and within a foo.
Actually, it's not global scope. Now we created a function reference, right? Earlier we discussed all the functions are objects. Hope you can remember. In that case, to object you can add a new property or remove property. So we are simply adding another property called count.
Yeah. This particular, yeah, it's a function object, and within that I'm trying to add an attribute called count, and I'm assigning it. And when I'm just calling that particular function with the parameter inside a for loop, so it basically has to add, it has to do this console log, which it does 6, 7, 8, 9, and I have this dot count to keep track. And at the end, I'm saying foo.count, but I do have 0 here. If it's technically correct, I need to have 4, right? So what exactly happens over this dot count here?
Can anybody explain like what's going on over here? If you have any idea, you all get the example, right?
Does anyone know how did it got 0? So basically the first question is, if it's 0, if foo.count is 0, the question that we need to have is this dot count plus plus what it increased, or what variable it has increased, or in what context that count has been increased.
First of all, this is not going to error. It's going to actually execute properly. No errors will be there, and you will get this output. You can clearly see the output.
So the first question.
Before going to the details, let's try to get an answer from somebody.
Wait.
Anyone?
This count is iterative, but it's iterative within the scope of foo.
Okay, what is the scope of foo?
The function foo within the function of the foo function.
Okay.
And since the console log at the bottom is the global scope, when you console log it out there, it takes a value which is defined below.
So consider it as an object. Foo object is their function reference. Internally it is kind of like object, and you have property called count, and you are just logging it. If it is executing in the foo's context, it should work, right? Because if this is foo, then foo.count you are just incrementing, right? In your argument you said that it's working in foo's context. Easy. So it's a bit tricky. All of you, I guess, like a lot of people are here who does JavaScript heavily, but none of you have. I think most of you have come across these kind of scenarios, but I don't know why you can't guess this. So in this case, what happens is context. Context is where you are calling that particular function. Where, not what is inside. So whenever you take a look at context, think of where you are executing it. Right now, foo function, where are you executing it? In global scope. in that case, what is the context of this? Which is window. So window.count, it will try to increment, count variable will not be there, so it will be nan. So nan plus plus. When you try to increment undefined, then it will become not a number. Foo.count is defined here, that will remain 0. So you have to first of all understand whenever, like whatever the thing, in case if it is a function or an object, whatever it is, whenever you execute it, you have to think of the calling context, where you are calling it. Now you might argue, okay, then what happened with that object? Because it again should have the window, right? In case like if what I'm explaining is correct. So let's go into detail and see one by one, like example by example, what all rules are there and how to actually identify what happens with this. And then again, there are set of rules you have to keep in mind, and it's really simple once you know all the rules.
Okay, so as Johan mentioned, it's basically been called within the global or the Windows context. Because of that, we don't get actually the foo.count to be incremented. So one way that we know now even if I am a developer, if I see this dot count is getting 0, I might try to go for an alternative fix. And what I would basically do is I will just have another variable for another object, and I will set that as var.data, or this is just that I'm defining, and I will just basically go and do is I will have this, and I'll say data.count plus plus, and here also I do have data.count. So if I run this, I get 4. Now my work is done. Now how do you think that this 4 has been worked? How do you think that this 4 has been worked? Now it's worked. I just remove this and I have introduced a data object with an attribute called count, and I just call data.count, and the data.count gets updated. How do you think that? So even though I call,
This is straightforward, right?
yeah, this is obviously straightforward.
Nothing much is there. So think that we have this there without data. Just change it to this.
Whole thing.
Yeah, this don't count. Yes. All right.
So it's basically like this. Now even this dot count didn't work because I have this particular data object defined in the global state, and foo also being called in the global state of the Windows object. So when I actually have data.count plus plus, the data object with count attribute is available for me when I'm calling this particular function. Because of that, I was able to add and I was able to access it.
But in this case, you are seeing 0 because we are not accessing it with data, right? You have to simply say data, this dot data dot count. Do that, then you will be able to see 4.
Okay, here it has to be.
Oh yeah. You are simply passing the number, right? That is not a
No,
problem.
that is not.
Call I is the number. And the reference is to be equal. And then the context is global. Cannot read property count of undefined, which says data is undefined. Yeah, this variable.
To be defined on top of this.
No, it doesn't matter because you are calling it later on, right? Foo.count is there. Can you log the this log this to console. No, within the function.
If you're using why is it the
That is not the case.
Okay, it says 4 6. That is for the last line.
Yeah, no, you are trying to increment it first, right? We'll just comment this line now. Which line is it? We just did the pencil. Okay, this is window, right? So we are seeing window here, and okay, this is a bit weird. Anyway, we'll try this in the console itself without JSFiddle. I don't know how they handle scoping there. So if it is wrapped within the function and if it works in a different way, we won't be able to see it, right? Okay, now here 46, 47. Oh yeah, we removed this, right? Let's execute it again by editing the function. Okay. Okay, this looks good, right? We don't want to log data.count. We have to log, yeah, we have to log data.count, right? We want to see that only. Okay. Early on, it didn't work in JSFiddle because JSFiddle's now this particular window, what you are seeing, it's not a browser, right? So it again, like internally, might not be referring to Windows scope, global scope. It might have a function wrapped within, and it might be executing this particular code snippet within that function. And because of that, because of the side effects there, because of their implementation side effect, we are not seeing the output correctly. But if you execute this particular function in global scope, now you can clearly see that we were referring to global scope when we executed the function in global scope.
Yeah, so
Okay.
yeah, so that is one way that we used to do. We introduced an object. An object with an attribute that we need to be referred within the global scope, and we used to update that so that we get the count. And or else the normal way or the other way that we can do is using the lexical scope. Since I have defined the function name, I can also use foo.count plus plus, and I can uh, I can also call foo.count, and that should work. If not, I can use the call function and I can pass the context of foo to the foo function itself. That will also work. So that's basically now if I say this stuff count, and I call it like this. So So this is the other way. If you want to keep this dot count, this is the basically the right way to have the context being passed in a proper. And so what you can do is when you call the foo, when you want to execute the foo function, you use the call and you pass the context and you also pass the parameter which is need to be passed for that particular function. And then when you try to see, then it will work because now this foo function is being called explicitly informing that this has to be the context used for the function to execute as well as the parameter. So that's one solution or the proper solution that we can use to do the execution with the usage of this. And yeah. So basically, why we use this is now it's more like similar way that we use pronouns in English. So now let's take an English or the sentence say John is running fast because John is trying to catch the train. We don't normally reuse John at each and every time that we wanted to refer John. So instead of that, we try to say John is running fast because he is trying to catch the train. So he is kind of the pronoun that we also refer in the JS context with this keyword. This is something you can, it does at runtime and the binding happens at the runtime. And the context of this is based on the place where the function invocation happens. So we already have gone through examples where at what point the function is being used is the key. So that's one thing that we have to remember about this. So before we actually get into the session or what are the attributes of this which we need to consider, we have a few tips that we can use. One is, as I said before, it doesn't now. We also checked with the example previously. Even though we use this within a function, it doesn't mandatorily or it's not a hard and fast rule that this was within the scope of that function. It was referring at the first the global or the Windows scope. Because of that, we got 0 for that count. So there's no hard and fast rule. If you use this in a function, that means it refers to the function's context. It can go to the global scope as well, and it also depends on the way that we call that particular function. That is what it's mentioned in the first key point, and it's dynamic because on the runtime only the binding happens. And you also have the helpers or the way that you can impose context. Like explicitly, you can impose context using call, apply, or bind. So these are tips before we get into the context. So the ways that we can give new values to this, there are 6 to 7 ways that we can give. So the normal way is in the global context how this can have values, and then on the object construction level and on an object method, and maybe on the prototypes and the constructors, and you can have in simple functions, then the event listeners, and the last is the arrow function which we normally use. So let's go one by one on how it has been used or how we can use it. So when in a global context, now let's say on a global context I define a function and I say console.this. Though this is within that particular function, now when I call my function, this will refer to the Windows object. Because this is referred to the Windows object is because I am calling it within the Windows context. And I am not specifying anything for the my function as explicitly any context has to be imposed. So it defaults captures that it is being called within the Windows object, so it refers to the Windows object. So that is within the global context. And okay, and when you take within an object constructor, now we have an example called human, and that is basically a function, and I'm just giving this dot age equals to age, and the age is what I get it as a parameterized value. There are two questions that I have here. One is I'm just calling human and I'm giving a value to that, saying 22. And then I'm calling new human and 24. What could be the console logs for both? Like, will both be executed and you will get values or not? Does anyone have an idea?
With what we learned so far. I think you all know the answer for the second one. Is it again confusing?
Yeah. Second one could be the obvious. Okay. So what happens here is the first one gets undefined and the second one gets age. The human object with age attribute 24 will be displayed on the console log. Why is the first one is undefined? Is it just because I didn't add new there? Does anyone know how exactly a new operator works? So these are the two questions I have. Is it because I added? It's because that I didn't add new there. Is it undefined? And does anyone know how a new operator works?
We discussed about new, right?
Okay, basically it's like this. Now I have this particular function, and did anyone observe that there is no return? So how does this displace the human object and age 24 without I'm having a return?
Okay, how does a function becomes a constructor? There is no such thing called constructor functions that you have to understand. Any function can be called with new keyword. So new is a keyword where you can simply use it in front of a function. You can simply have a simple function name. There's no hard and fast rule saying, okay, function should be capital if you want to call it with new. There is no such thing. You can call any function like this. Then you might think, okay, what will happen if I have a return in the function? Does anybody know? So say for an instance, I have a function which returns a number. If you call it with new, what will happen? Have you ever tried? So the basic idea you have to get is, like, this is not directly related to this topic. JavaScript is an object-driven language. It's not an object-oriented language. You have certain object-oriented behaviors there which you can emulate with a certain set of language features, but it is not object-oriented. And whatever you have in your mind about object-oriented concepts in all the other languages doesn't apply as is here. So you have to understand JavaScript as is and then think of these concepts in a way you will understand, but you have to surely understand what is happening here. So I'm not going to give you the answer what will happen if you new up a function with a return statement. So try it out and see what will happen.
Yeah, so we will be discussing about new constructor in the following up slide. So we can also verify, or we can also come for an answer for what Johan was asking. So basically what happens here is, I will just give one of the attributes of new. As Johan mentioned, new is, there is no hard and fast rule that we need to have new for in an object-oriented principle way, that if you have a class, you try to have a new and you create an instance of it. It's not just like that. on JS level, even for functions that you call with a new. So what exactly happens with when you call a function with a new? Exactly happens is it tries to now if for this particular context I am giving that attribute. If there is no return type, or if that particular function doesn't allow a return, or it doesn't execute, or it doesn't code a return saying that return.age is not there, it itself goes and gets the attribute and returns it back. So that's one of those attributes of new. We will discuss the other attributes as well when we go.
Yeah, so let me add a few things there. So this context, right now if you take a look at the answer of the second line, it says human object which has age 24, right? So what actually happens is when you call a function with a new keyword, if it doesn't have a return statement in the first line, before even executing the first line, out of thin air it will simply create object literal, and that will become this, which happens internally in the JSX, and it will assign whatever the things you have here to that context, which got created automatically, and this function will return that particular object when you call this keyword with a function with a new keyword. So that is what's happening inside underneath. So that's why you are getting an object which has an age property with the value 24, but in this case it doesn't have any output. I mean, it doesn't have any return statement, so you're getting undefined. And what's going to happen to age in that case? So it's going to get created in the global scope, because now you are executing the function in global scope, and this particular age property will get assigned to window.
So if you're gonna have multiple new human being defined with different age values, it's gonna be unique for that. It's because as Johan mentioned, with the new constructor, it's gonna create a new object which is unique for that particular instance, and whatever that you do within that is gonna be unique for that. So wherever you have now, let's say if you have multiple other instances that you create for human with different other names, with different other ages, that's going to be unique for it. Okay. So now this is a bit modified from whatever that we checked previously. Here we're going to have at the initial stage itself, we're going to have a variable human, and I'm going to define as an empty object. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a method attribute for it with a function definition giving parameters pass name and age, and then I initialize this dot name, this dot age, and whatever the parameterized values I assign it to that, and then I have this dot get age, and again it's a function and it returns this dot age. So when I try to do a console log, and now these are definitions. Now when I try to do a console log of human.name, what could be the value at this instant? Now then sequence of execution happens. This is being defined, and then I come here, and when I say human.name, what will be the value that we will get? And when I say human.getAge, what will be the value I will get? Does anyone know? Undefined, right? So now when I try to do human.initialize method, and I pass these values, and then when I try to do I think there's nothing much complicated there. So we will be getting those values. So now here what we can identify is I cannot create multiple humans. Just I have bounded to one particular human instance, and I have an initialize method, and I can just keep on using initialize method, I can just keep on changing the human, override the human basically. I can't be having a new instance of it. So how we can have a new instance of it with having an initialize method? It's basically you need to take this, wherever that it gets created, we need to make sure that I'm creating a new object. So that is what the new keyword is exactly doing. I'm just trying to create a new, when you say that new and you call that particular function, it tries to, when there is nothing to be defined, it tries to create that particular new object. So that is what I'm exactly doing. So whatever the new was trying to do, I was trying to do it over here. Okay. So now this was built. This was used to give an example of how prototypes are being used. So I hope that you all learnt about prototypes when you are learning about new keyword. So basically here the same example has been modified a bit, and I'm just having a function where I don't have a human object or anything. I'm just having a function. So it's a function object I'm having at the start itself, and I'm having age and name with an initial value, and then when I'm using a get age, I'm just setting whatever the parameterized value that I get for this age, and I'm returning this age. And then I have my human constructor dot prototype, and there I have a get name function, and there also I'm passing a name parameter and I'm returning it. So the main usage of prototype over here is it helps to resume whatever the context that has been used within the human constructor when you are defining it. Like at this particular instance itself, when I use new my human constructor, it's basically this particular function will have a new object or new object function defined at the start, and then then it will be having attributes age and name, and it will be set with initial values. So when you do a console.vd, you will be getting these two initial values at the start because it's at the start. And then when I do vd.getAge, at this point it overrides the 0 value with whatever the 22 that we used, and it returns 22 here. And then when I do vd.getName, it again overrides that value, and you will get the vd name here. And when I again at the last, when you try to console log, I'll be having the new updated object. So this is also one way that we are. So basically, what happens here is my human constructor.prototype will also resume whatever the context that you've been using over on the top, or with get age. It also appends whatever the get name value that you are trying to give, and at the last you will have an video object being updated fully with both name and age.
And one question, what is the difference between getName function and getAge function? Obviously, there are two different functions, but what I'm asking is characteristics-wise, what is the difference? By defining it in the prototype and in the constructor. We discussed this earlier. So, the difference is, even though I explained it earlier, now you will be able to get a good idea. Now I said whenever you use the new keyword in front of a function, it creates an object out of thin air, and it assigns all these properties to that particular object. And this particular getAge function reference will again get created for that particular object, and it will get assigned, and we will do all these operations whenever you call it. And if you create 10 instances out of this, with the new keyword, then 10 objects will get created and 10 references, 10 instances of this function again will get created each time whenever you call new and create an instance out of it. But prototype level functions, they don't get created all the time. What will happen is, even though these get created like multiple times, whenever you create a prototype and if you call a prototype function, that will always refer to this particular prototype. So whatever the instances you are creating, it refers back to this prototype and it will look up for the methods which are available in the prototype, and it doesn't again and again create these prototype methods. So that is the benefit.
Okay. Now I have just a simple function, and I have a set timeout within that simple function, and within the set timeout, I'm just calling speak to me, and the speak to me has a console log. And when I call that particular simple function or do something later, do you think that I'll get I'm back here from all what we discussed? So it's basically you won't be able to get I'm back here, and so it's basically will say speak to me is not a function. And why would it say that speak to me is not a function? Because now let's say that I'm having simple function and dot do something later, and within the simple function itself I have speak to me, and why this dot speak to me is not accessible within do something later?
So if you read the description, you have the answer.
So we do have defined another set timeout function, and that function is not within the context of simple function. It's a different context. So it again goes to the Windows definition. So this dot speak to me is not defined within the Windows. So how we can make this work?
First of all, set timeout is a browser API, which is a web API, and it gets invoked this particular function reference, whatever the function we are passing, this anonymous function will get invoked after 10 milliseconds, and when that gets called, browser calls it in Windows scope because it is out of context, right? So this particular context, the browser doesn't have any idea, so it calls on its global scope.
So how we can fix this? How we can impose? How we can tell set timeout to have simple functions context? Is equal that. Yeah, that's one simple way to go for. So that's what I'm saying, referring to a new variable and assigning it. That is this equal that, or you can use a factor of functions, and or else you can use bind functions. You can so this is the example for an event listener type. So I have an element which is basically it's a div. It's a div, and and I also have a click method function which has a console log, and I have an event listener, click event listener, and for that listener, I have a click method. I have passed the click method, So at this particular point, uh, when this particular point now, let's say that I go and click on the div class that I have defined. If I go and click it, what is the context of this? I mean, basically when you click, the event listener keeps on checking for that click, and it calls this click method. So when I do that click, what is the context of this? And if I just call click method, what is the context of this? That I'm sure that you all know, right? Like when you do a click onto the div class, div HTML tag, it's gonna be the divs object which will be used within this. And if you normally call it, it's gonna be the Windows object, because the place that I'm calling is what it matters for you to check the context, unless if you explicitly give a context pass for that particular function. And there is and also we have arrow functions as well. Now let's say that we have that set timeout. I think it's better if we. So here what I have done is I have used bind, and I have defined this at this particular point that this is the do something later is this context. So I bind that to the set timeout function. Because of that I'm back here. That's one way to do. And now if you think about the fat arrow functions, you can or else other thing that we all said, if you all have that equals this, and then that dot speak to me, also another way to do that. Or else you can remove the function definition that you have put within here, and you can use the arrow. That will also make it work. So arrow functions, basically it always check at what particular is it within the global scope or is it within the function scope. So if it's within the function scope that you are calling this, I mean with the fat operator and the parenthesis, so it always refers to the function scope. Or else if you take it outside and if you have it, then it's within the global scope. So it has two identifications, whether it's within the function or the global scope, and it binds automatically to those.
And one small thing here is now if you really dig deep into this is that binding. Whereas it will when you execute, when you think about the execution context in the execution point, what happens is it will create a variable called that, and it will assign this to that, and it will refer to that and call speak to me. And some folks say that okay, replace all your functions with fat arrow. That is wrong. You really need the function syntax, and it is not obsolete. You have to use it in several places. There are several instances, and if you really want to solve complex problems, if you are writing a library, then you might have to use function syntax. So make sure where to use function and where to use fat arrow.
And yeah, so this is an example of you explicitly say, as we discussed before, this is being concluded or defined based on where you call a particular function, and within that function if the this is being used. So one way you can override it is basically you can forcefully give a context for it and say use this context when you are executing a particular function. So here we have show details, and yeah, the function has two parameters, age and gender, and we have different ways you can explicitly say. One is apply. The difference between apply and call is you give the function parameters with an array, or here it's normally you go with commas in call. So basically these two, at the point itself it executes that particular function with whatever the context that you give and the parameters. But we also use bind. So what is the difference between these two and the bind? Here itself you can see the difference, right? So here there is no return type. Here we basically return that particular function. And what kind of a usage that we could have with a bind, except the call, apply and call. The one main function, the usage is you can give the context of show details with human and whatever the parameters, and you can since you use bind, you return that particular function. The function gets returned with the context and the parameter being given. So, and at later point, wherever you want, you can execute the function. Here, it's within this particular line itself. It applies the context, it gives the parameters, and it executes. Here, you can apply and give the parameters, you get the function, and then you can later execute. That's one advantage of bind that we can use. And also this is kind of an hard bind where we won't be able to override it the context later on at some point. So we can check on the hard binds in the following slides. So that is one obvious usage of bind is it returns the function with whatever the context and the variables that you give, and then on a later stage where you can use it to execute. Okay. So this common mistake we have discussed with the example, the very first example that we did. So here it's basically though you say that human.getName, you assign it to a variable called getHumanName, but it doesn't exactly translate with the context or with the human context. I think we explained it before as well. It's basically the reference. It doesn't do a deep clone of what exactly its parent and it's all the whole object. It just gets the reference of get name function and give to it as a new function for it. So when you do a get human name, which has a this at this particular point, the get human function is the Windows context. So because of that, it will be undefined. Only if you do a get human when you execute with this as a separate. Human.getName, if you execute as a function, that will work. That will give John. But when you pass this getName or when you assign this getName to a new variable, only this particular function reference is being given, not the whole human object is being given to it as a context. Because of that, when you execute it with whatever the context that you are in, that context will only be used to this. So if you use this in a different function context, that function context will only be used. Yeah, since it's being used within the Windows context, the Windows context is used, and because of that, it's undefined. So that's common mistake that we go. I think Johan explained about this at the start itself. Now, as he said, we need to think about at what point a particular now let's say that I have defined a particular function called base, and at this base, if I'm using this, it's not mandatorily says that, or it does not mandatorily defines that whatever the this which we call within this particular function scope should be within the function scope. It always means wherever you call the base is what it matters, and what context that it is in is what it matters. So for that we need how we can track down if there is a this kind when you implement this within different functions, and if you mess up, which we normally do, how we can track down what context is being used, and how we can resolve it. So this is what the two things that we have to consider. One is the call stack and the call site. So call site is when a function is being executed. Now let's say in this particular I'm having a function called this, and at the global scope, at the Windows level, I'm calling the base. Okay, and so what happens is when I do this, this base function will get called, and within that the base console.log base will get executed. So this will be displayed first, and then the bar gets called. So this is the call side. Which means call side means where a particular function is being called. So if from the call side you can identify okay, if this particular call side been given with a context, then you can say okay, this context has been used. So what happens is now call side is this. At this point, the call side for bar is within this. And once bar is being called, again the bar will, the console log will be shown, and then I'm calling foo. So the call side for foo is this. While this is being happening, the call stack gets updated. So when base is called, the call stack will be inserted with base. And then bar is called, then on top of that, the bar gets updated as updated to the call stack. And within the bar, when I call the foo is also updated. So call stack is something gets override wherever you call a new function, call stack gets referred to that. But call side gets referred to that. Call stack is the history of the function executions that happen. So here the order will be the base is for call stack, the order will be base and then bar and then foo. So that's basically it, and you can check where it points every time that you see.
If you call all of these functions saying this dot bar, this dot foo, then what do you think will be the answer? So we are going to call BAZ function, and within that, if we have this dot bar, is it going to work? Okay, and inside bar, if we are going to call this dot foo, is it going to work?
No, it's not.
Okay, you don't have a snippet, right? You have it.
Yeah, I have a thing.
Sorry about dragging this session. It's his last day, so we have to wrap it up. And others can refer the.
This is for the call stack.
Just copy this and open up the console. Okay. What happened? So, if you all understood, now I'm calling bar BAZ, and when I call BAZ, the context is window, global scope. And when I'm calling BAR, what is the scope here? Which is window. So I am calling this dot bar, which is window dot bar. Correct, right? Window dot bar. And this context in bar again will become window because I'm executing this in window context. Function scopes context itself refers to window context. Because of that, this works. If I call this with some other context, it won't work. So it's always confusing if you don't get the idea correctly. So always keep in mind, it is all about the call side. And what is the context of the call side? Right now, even though we are calling this function within a function, that function's scope is window. And it is getting inherited to this one because I am calling it in window, and this automatically becomes the window scope. And if I call this function saying bar dot call with BAZ scope, BAZ, then that function, within that function I don't have anything called BAR, right? Then it won't work. So call sites context, and it is again misleading because when you think about call sites context, you will just think, okay, window is there, now window is gone, it won't work. That is not the case. You have to correctly understand what is going on, and that only one rule is there, call site, that will always work. If you understand call site correctly, you will understand this.
Okay, so for in this, we have 4 rules to be defined now. From all what we have went through, all the examples that we have went through, we're gonna again refresh them through with the 4 rules that we have, and these 4 rules can be used when you are trying to implement any functions with the concept of this. So basically, the rule 1 is the default binding. Yeah, so it basically tries to define what context that has to be used here. So we have defined a variable called variable a, which is equals to 2, which is within the Windows context, and I'm also defining a function called foo, which is console.log this.a, and I also call that particular function foo, which is the call site for foo is within the Windows context. So when because of that, this dot a will be giving you 2, and if you are using strict, it will be an undefined, because within the Windows, if it's Windows context, it gives you an undefined.
Okay, let me reiterate. So what's happening is early on in all the examples, we didn't have strict mode. In strict mode, it's a bit tricky and it is safe to play with. So what's happening is when you refer to this early on, what happened was it was creating an object outside of this scope, right? Whatever the scope which a function was, immediately outside the scope, whatever which is, in case if it is window, it will create this object, whatever the variable within that particular scope. In this case, window scope. But when you use strict mode, it won't lead to the window. It will simply throw error saying if this is not defined or this is not passed, there will be error. Or in this case, if this function has something called a, or if you are simply defining a property, that property will get defined, but nothing will get leaked to the window scope when you simply call it. So with that being said, now if you have worked with JavaScript, if you have a deep understanding, then you might have seen all these anonymous functions in libraries, right? And on the top, as the first line within the function or on the file, they have always put strict mode on. So what they are trying to do is, whenever you create all these variables and whatever the things which are within the library, what if any of those gets leaked to the global scope? They have to avoid it, right? So to do that, they are always using strict mode. In that case, it won't anyway leak the global scope. So that is kind of like a fail safe. So first rule is global. It will always get assigned to the global scope depending on the context you are executing it. If you are executing it within the function, that function scope will get applied to the scope of the calling. And if you are using strict mode, it won't leak. That is the second thing. And call site rule applies over here. And other than that, whatever the strict bindings you have, bind, call, apply, can override. That's all. So whatever the instance, whenever you see this keyword, you can simply tackle the functionality of this, what will be the value of this with these particular rows.
And then the second rule is to have implicit binding. So it's basically you pass the or else you can see from this particular example, I do have a function called foo, and I do have two objects. One object has an attribute 42, and the other one has an object 1 has an attribute a with 2. And the difference is the object 1 calls the object 2, and the object 2 calls the function foo. So if I call object 1 dot object 2 dot foo.
Yeah, so why we say implicit here is implicitly this context gets applied. So if there is a function here, and if I call object 1 dot that particular function, it will get executed in object 1's context, and this will refer to object 1. But in this case, if you go to object 1 dot object 2, now the context of this particular function which you are going to execute on top of object 2 will become object 2, not object 1. So implicitly, whenever you traverse through object hierarchy, it will refer back to that self object, whatever the self object which you are calling that function on. Unless you explicitly say, okay, I want some other context, implicit binding will be this. So it is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, so when you are doing an implicit binding, there are cases where you can lose the scope of that particular binding.
So again, in this example, if you take a look at this, now you have an object and it has a foo function assigned here, and whenever you assign that function to some other function, say bar, and if you try to call it, actually what happens is now you are calling it in Windows scope, and it is not referring to this object because you didn't call it on top of the object. So implicit binding will figure out, okay, now I am getting called in Windows scope, this is window. So it doesn't work. Okay, explicit binding. So here we are explicit saying, okay, implicitly we got all these values, but in case if you want to explicitly say, okay, execute this particular function on this particular object, it will work that way. So as you already have the understanding of how COBOL apply keywords work, you can simply use those function prototypes, whatever the functionalities, and call it this way. And it is explicitly hardbound. And hard binding rule applies if you go into a nested level also. So same thing, if you take a look at this is a bit advanced one, right? So we have a foo function, and object is there, and bar function is calling foo function with the object, so obj. And within this function scope, whenever we are calling bar in Windows scope, the ideally what will happen is if you call it without call, then it is referring to Windows scope, right? This will be window. But in this case, you are hard binding and saying, no, this should be obj, and obj has a variable, so console log will have value 2. Got it, right? But in this case, whenever you say set timeout bar, now then again you are getting 2 because even though browser is calling it, whoever is calling it, we have a hard binding here. We are hard binding and saying wherever you are executing it, execution context doesn't matter. I am hard binding and saying, okay, always execute this function on the object. And wherever, whatever the context, it always works the same way. And new binding. So this we explained how it works actually, how this A gets created and where it gets assigned, and what is the value of bar actually, and how it comes to life, and how you are referring to it. It's pretty simple, just
Yeah.
like what I explained earlier.
And also now, if you don't have a return which has been defined, it constructs
New object
new
and
object
uses
and
it. If you return an object, then it will use that particular object only. This won't make any sense there. Okay, and lexical, this is the fat arrow function. When this particular function gets called, we are directly hard binding this to foo. So if you call now, what we are doing here is we are creating a foo function, and foo function itself is returning one other arrow function, and we have two objects, and we are calling foo function with object
object one.
object one.
So
That
basically,
context will be object one, which has a, right?
Yeah.
This dot a will be available, and when you call bar with object two, then again we are saying, okay, calling context of this particular bar function will be object two. However, early on we created this hard binding context, right? And we said that this contains this particular value, and this particular variable was never used because we are referring to this dot a. We are not referring to the argument a. So this object 2 will get ignored even though it is passed. It will come here and it will refer back to object 1 because it was the binding we had early on, and it was there because we are referring to this context.
so basically what happens is, now if you on a best practice way that we check is, now if you're gonna have newly constructed objects, make sure that you all have new defined there, and it's an order of thing that you all check, and then